First, I'd like to recognize some people who are here. Dr. Bernice DeGan Scott. She's assistant professor of economics at Spelman College. And Spelman has kindly, Dr. Scott. Clayton Haywood, who's a Trinidad and Tobago assistant in Atlanta. Clinton. Noel Charles, who's president of the Trinbago Connection. Noel, welcome. Thanks for being here. Mr. Vance Amor, I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. Premier of Nevis is here. Could you please stand? Did I get that right? Amor? Amory. Excellent. And Diane Dupree, she was Prime Minister to Dr. Eric Williams. I'm sorry, did I say she was Prime Minister to Dr. Eric Williams. She was Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams' secretary, political secretary. Diane. This morning we spent some time talking about education and scholarship issues as related to capitalism and slavery. One of the things that we started to talk about, and I want to just briefly touch on this a little bit because I felt we really didn't get a chance to come to some closure on it, was the issue of trying to define what is success for children, trying to look at some of the issues of race in education. And Cheryl can talk a little bit more about this later on. But I felt that it's important for Trinidadians and Tobagonians to redefine what is success for us. Even as with Eric Williams, as his father wanted him to do, was either become a lawyer or going to medicine, I feel that it's important for us to redefine what is success. It's not simply being a lawyer or being or having an MD degree. And that's something that the country has really grappled with, because we're not seen as being successful if we haven't engaged in either one of those. And that kind of redefinition is important. Secondly, one of my colleagues at Fordham University, with support from a grant from the World Bank, this is Dr. Abby Harris, visited Jamaica on a number of occasions and helped the Jamaican government struggle with looking at that the common entrance exam. And I think one of the possible outcomes is that Jamaica is now going to get rid of it and find a way to help transition children into secondary education in a manner that's more humane, in a form that's more compassionate. And I feel that Trinidad also and Tobago also needs to find a way to transition children into a secondary education in a more humane fashion, because at this point in time, it is not humane. In fact, I think we're doing a great disservice to our children when we do start labeling them very early as being not competent or not successful, when in fact we have been producing children who are very, very capable and very talented in a number of different areas. So that's a little spiel I wanted to give at the end that I now choose to give now. Now that we've had a chance to talk about it and have some nourishment and so forth. Our next panel focuses on the political aspects of the work of capitalism and slavery. And we have two panelists, Roderick Turton. Rod Turton is a Trinidadian and Tobagonian who now lives in New York and teaches political science and Caribbean studies at the City University of New York. He's the chairman of the Caribbean American Action Committee and coordinator of the Pan-Caribbean Research Institute. First, we'll have Rod Turton speak. Again, the same rules apply in terms of the amount of time for each presentation. Thank
you. Good day. I want to thank the Friends of Trinidad and Tobago for inviting me to participate in this tremendous event, because that is really what it is. I also think that it is a tremendous opportunity for us to be able to deal with the questions, directly or indirectly, that confront us in Trinidad and Tobago today, to have some theoretical basis against which to understand what the problems are, how they have evolved, so that we could be better able to come to grips with how to resolve them. I think that this discussion is particularly important in the light of what is happening in Haiti today, in Cuba, the situation in the rest of the Caribbean, a situation almost exactly as described by Dr. Williams in several of his publications and his public speeches over the years. So, for me at least, as we deal with this question of capitalism and slavery today, I think we have to be very clear in our minds, or I have to be very clear in my mind, what it means for me and what it ought to mean for us. I don't think that capitalism and slavery could mean for us today what it meant for Dr. Williams when he began the research for the book and when the book was actually published. We are living in a world today that is fundamentally different in every sense of the word. Capitalism and slavery, as the content of the book indicates, was looking at capitalist society at the dawn of the transition from mercantile capitalism into industrial capitalism, the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. We are engaged in a capitalist world today that is fundamentally different from the world described in Capitalism and Slavery. The slavery that Dr. Williams speaks about is the slavery that we come to know as chattel slavery, human beings owned by someone else. We speak about slavery today as slavery in the form of wage slavery. Human beings are not chattels anymore, but capitalist society has created a whole new form of enslavement. So I think we ought to be very clear in our minds today as we celebrate this tremendous event of capitalism and slavery, what it is we are celebrating and how we ought to think about it. But before I get into any great detail in that, I want to say a few words emanating out of a discussion that took place this morning, and also within the larger context of understanding how a great book comes to be written. Because one seems to suggest, or one would derive from some of the discussions we have heard earlier, that a great book is written by a great mind who, out of the blue, just thinks about great things and decides to research these great things and to put them down to paper. I don't know of any great book that was ever written that way. The other thing that we have to understand is that Dr. Williams has come from a particular historical experience at a particular juncture in the history of black people. He was born in the early part of the 20th century, a period in which there was a tremendous preoccupation with black people and with blackness. Dr. Sylvester Williams from Trinidad, a lawyer in Britain at the time, had begun the Pan-Africanist movement with the first Pan-African Congress in London in 1900. People like Dr. Du Bois was involved in it, and Dr. Du Bois would give the rest of his life to the development and expansion of the Pan-Africanist movement. We had a number of other pan-movements that were beginning to evolve in that time. The Pan-Arabist movement, the Pan-Slavic movements, and so on. So that what you were looking at was a world in which people were beginning to think in a much larger context than the purely nationalist preoccupation that we seem to have regenerated to today. The next thing that I think we ought to be very clear about so we understand the historical background, the theoretical background to capitalism and slavery, is a number of very important works were being done in the period. You had Dr. Du Bois' thesis for his doctorate at Harvard in 1896, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade. It is said to be the first serious and scientific study of black people anywhere in the world at any point in time. Then in 1897, Dr. Du Bois brought out, which was the first sociological study of an ethnic community in the United States or anywhere as it related to black people, the Philadelphia Negro, that had begun a whole new school of sociology here in the United States. Then in 1903, he published what has come to be known as one of the classics of the black experience in the United States, The Souls of Black Folk. And then in 1938, he published what is to be the most definitive work on the Civil War in the United States, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880. That is what was going on at this period in time. Then you had C.L.R. James. James was preoccupied with the whole relationship between Europe and Africa. They had organized themselves around the Abyssinian movement with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Not too long after, George Padmore, another great Trinidadian, who is today described as the father of Pan-Africanism, formed the International African Service Bureau. And that International African Service Bureau have published some of the most definitive works on African people as it related to the relationship between Europe and Europe's colonial territories in Africa. Among the works that was published then by Padmore was Africa, Europe's Third Empire. The whole discussion about Marxism and communism and the African world was published in Pan-Africanism or Communism, which remain a definitive work to this day. And then C.L.R. James, as part of that work of the Bureau, and people have to understand the historical context of the Black Jacobins. The Black Jacobins were never intended to be a competition with anybody, and it was not intended to describe the Black Frenchmen in the Caribbean. The Bureau had ascribed to James the task of finding some historical experience of black people in the world that could lay the historical and theoretical and intellectual basis for the African Revolution on the African continent. Black Jacobins was not written for the Caribbean. It is not until 1969, in what has come to be known as the appendix from Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro, that he said, I am attempting to do today for the Caribbean what I did for Africa in 1938. So we have to understand that. It is within this context that you're going to have to understand capitalism and slavery. James was associated with these people, Williams. And Dr. Williams himself tells us in one of his writings that the first time I had seen anywhere the concept that slavery was abolished for economic reasons rather than humanitarian reasons was in the Black Jacobins. That is Dr. Williams' words. And it has nothing to do with whether James wrote the Black Jacobin and all the vulgar stupidity that is associated with that discussion. Anybody who wants to suggest that Eric Williams was not a tremendous intellectual and a tremendous person in his own right is somebody that needs to have their head examined. So it is not a discussion for us here today at all. It's to understand the historical origin of an important work that has remained important after 50 years. And the question for us is why it has remained important after 50 years. And the reason why, and Williams has himself explained to us, I'll go through in a minute. But even within the context of Williams himself, Capitalism and Slavery is not the first or the last statement of political wisdom by Dr. Eric Williams. Capitalism and Slavery was followed by a tremendous body of work that led to his research work for his doctorate. He's also the first and probably the only person outside of Fernando Ortiz to do a comprehensive study of the Negro in the Caribbean. And I don't understand why people speak about capitalism and slavery and do not speak about the Negro in the Caribbean. You have to understand the connection between these things. By the time he had come to do Capitalism and Slavery, he was an accomplished intellectual who had studied fully and fully understood the development of Caribbean society as an integral and an organic part of that evolving world that was taking place in Europe in the 19th century. That is what Capitalism and Slavery is. And we have to be very clear about these things. And Capitalism and Slavery is the only book Eric Williams has ever written. What do I mean by that? I remember as a young man, James was speaking to us and he said, you know, Melville had only written one book, Moby Dick. All the other books that he had written was in preparation for that great work. And that is what capitalism and slavery is. It is one piece, one moment, so to speak, in a historical evolution of a great West Indian. Because he produced not only the Negro in the Caribbean, he produced capitalism and slavery. And if you look, for instance, at his book, Inward Hunger, you would find he calls it the education of a colonial. 2/3 of Inward Hunger deals with what? The period of his political life in Trinidad and Tobago. So when Dr. Williams is talking about education, he's not talking about Oxford and Cambridge at all. It is a whole lot more than that he's speaking about. He's speaking about the total development of the human personality within a specific historical condition, the colonial condition of Caribbean society. And he began to prepare himself for that in the study of the Negro in the Caribbean. He did examination, he did a tremendous amount of work in Haiti, in Cuba. In fact, most of the work was done in Cuba. If you read him and you hear what he has to say about Cuba, it is from Eric Williams I got to realize that the largest single body of historical material on the African anywhere in the world is at the University of Havana in Cuba. So we have to be very clear when we stand here today or sit here today to celebrate capitalism and slavery and Dr. Eric Williams, what it is we are celebrating. He formed the PNM. The PNM was not a party. The PNM was a social institution in the life of a colonial people. And the PNM was not just the party, the PNM. The party created the organ, the nation. And I want to say a few words about that before I finish here today. Because it's very unfortunate that today we have neither the PNM nor the nation. You have the party, you have the nation, and one of the most creative institutions developed anywhere in the third world to struggle against colonialism, the University of Woodford Square and its constituent colleges. You cannot understand what is happening unless you understand that. Because I was educated at the University of Woodford Square. That is why today, when they asked me to give a biography of myself, all I said is I came from Trinidad, I'm teaching here. Because my education is at the University of Woodford Square. That's why I got it. Whatever appreciation I have of the world in which I live today, that is where I got it. I was a young man just going into high school, but had the privilege of listening to from slavery to Shagaramas. One of the pieces that I teach almost every semester in my theory course, Massa De Done. And we have to understand what he means by that, because if you read Massa De Done, you'll see he does the historical piece in the first part, and then he has a PNM program, some of the things done by the party in the last part of it. The connection has been made from Massa in the old day and Massa in the modern period, because we have a lot of Massa still in Trinidad and Tobago today, including in the PNM. So we have to be clear about all of these things. My time is almost up, unfortunately, because I have said almost nothing. But I want to end by saying this. We would do a disservice to Dr. Williams and to capitalism and slavery and to the tremendous contribution that the PNM and Williams and his work, his academic and intellectual work, has made to the people of the Caribbean if we do not understand another important dynamic in looking at the PNM. I was just in high school when PNM came into being. I met CLR James that I would continue to have a lifelong relationship with till his death through the PNM. I became in 1966 a foundation member of the Workers' and Farmers' Party to oppose the PNM. But the capacity and the ability and the commitment to politics and the direction that my politics stood was precisely as a result of having lived in the period of the PNM. It is the PNM that prepared me for the period when I could have the guts to stand up and oppose the PNM. And we have to understand that. That is why whenever anybody asks me to come and speak about Dr. Williams, many people believe I am a foundation member of the PNM. because of the way I speak about it. And all of us who have come up in that period are products of the PNM, whether we like it or not. The PNM made accessible to the Trinidad and the West Indian community and knowledge of the world in which we live. It made young people like me come to meet people that would have a tremendous and permanent impact on the kind of life I live and the world that I want to see for myself and my children. And I want to end by saying, I don't know if I should say long live the PNM. It might sound provocative in the light of what is going on today. But whatever might happen to the PNM, it has played a tremendous role in the development of the Caribbean people and in individuals like myself. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Rod. I want you to know, in preparing for this day and writing out the program, one of the things that I was really concerned about, and before I say that, Rod, you should know that I only imitate people that I respect, is that I remember putting the program together and saying, you know, when I put the sign up that says, Rod, you have 3 minutes, I could just see Rod saying, don't tell me I have 3 minutes. This is an important discussion going on here. You can't cover this in 3 minutes. You have to understand the severity of what is going on here. That is what we're talking about today. So, Rod, I'm glad that when I put the 3 minutes up, you didn't say, don't tell me I have 3 minutes. So thank you very much.